Can you discuss moral realism versus moral anti-realism and moral skepticism in general? So let's first off start by defining moral realism. I think a lot of people that are not in the actual entity of philosophical discipline probably don't know what that is. Moral realism essentially is an ontological theory or thesis, if you will, that prescribes the idea that moral judgments can be considered factual, implying that not only is a moral judgment an objectively correct premise, but that moral judgment proscribes what ought or ought not to be the case for an individual's behavior in general. So if someone, for example, states that behavior is immoral, then a moral realist would say that is a fact, and not only should that individual in question immoral, but any individual that sort of reiterates or copies this behavior is also immoral. It's quite hard to grasp, but continuing on. Notice how I said can, because moral realists only agree to the premise that moral facts can exist. They don't necessarily exact on the specific moral facts themselves. So that actually differs. All they agree on is the very proposition that moral facts can exist. They don't specify what moral judgments are to be considered moral facts, which also indicates that there can be moral judgments that are not moral facts. The only premise that really matters to them is, okay, moral facts can exist, which most people that specifically that are not in this philosophical field would probably never subscribe to, because morality seems so volatile. But continuing on, someone might ask, what makes these moral assertions facts to a moral realist? Essentially, what does this are quote-unquote suitable agents and actions, which can certainly vary from what is considered suitable from individual to individual, meaning this can be arbitrary and dependent upon an individual's discretion, which to me personally makes me question moral realism and the idea of a moral fact if the suitable agents and moral relations can vary from person to person. How can we establish something as fact if the sort of structure that allows it to be considered fact can differ from person to person? That's just kind of questionable to me personally. However, to be quite honest, in the philosophical field, from what I've read from peer-reviewed articles, this ontological thesis is hard to characterize, meaning depending on the moral realist you are speaking with, the parameters I just established could change, and the premises, obviously, for these moral facts being moral facts can change, as I just explained. So moral realism is just a very peculiar, I would say, subfield of philosophical discipline. And now to get to the anti-realists, the anti-moral realists, they can come in many forms, as moral realism can come in many forms. There are non-cognitives, that's what they're called. I believe another type of anti-moral realist is called a non-relativist. And I could go on and on about defining them, but I'll just go ahead and give the most common rebuttals to moral realism. One of them was from a very revered philosopher in the 70s called John Mackie. He asserts that if moral factual values existed, they would be particularly bizarre and difficult to grasp, and here's why. He goes on to explain that propositions in general with a truly objective truth value have the natural property of being found and inevitable. For example, 1 + 1 = 2. And if you were to put two things together, you would get the sum of two, right? So there is this inevitable outcome of finding this objective reality. But when it comes to moral values, you can't really do that, right? Which is the point he's trying to make. And he also goes on to say, to further reinforce his antithetical stance, that moral realism can be negated by ethical relativism, which is a phenomenon that from culture to culture, morality could widely vary. Which is unexplainable, which I agree with him on, to be quite honest. So that naturally contradicts the fundamental premise of moral realism and the idea that that moral facts can exist. So hence moral facts cannot truly exist, according to Mackie. To continue on, a much more simple challenge that I'll explain, because I know some of this stuff can go over your head if you're not a philosopher, is that emotions, attitudes, and interests can vary, and that moral disagreements simply reflect the fact that the moral claims people embrace are dependent upon your emotion, your subjectivity, etc. So simply put, moral realism to me, in general, is questionable. I think that morality has been volatile in a fluctuating sort of realm of intellectual endeavor since the beginning of time.
So
Morality
much
could
gray
widely
area. That's the
vary.
problem.
Yeah, that's the problem. It could widely vary from culture to culture, in different points in human history, and even in simultaneous points in human history, they can vary. You can go to the Middle East, you can go to sub-Saharan Africa, and the cultures and their moral compass will certainly differ. Their traditions will certainly differ. So to try and claim that there's such thing as a moral fact just doesn't seem very valid to me. I can tend to see the appeal to the ideology. You want to establish moral truth and keep it at that. If anything, I think that the premise behind moral realism is to establish morality as an absolute thing. But I just
Yeah.
don't think morality falls in the realm of objectivity, to be quite
Like
honest.
morality is just not simple. It's a very contentious value, and the environment and context obviously can make things become more, complicated.
Yeah.
Like obviously, like if we have a moment where like if someone just goes and kills a person for no fucking reason at all, just right, just kills the guy, right? Obviously, like that's not like it's fucked. But like let's say like this there's actually a morality lesson introduced in Naruto, for an example with
Mm.
Danza with Itachi, where Danza basically asks Itachi if you're on a boat and there's one dude that's sick. And I mean, what do you do? Do you kill the guy and toss him off the boat, or do you try to help him or do the whatever and be a normal person or somehow something, right? And Itachi just simply says, "I'll kill the dude and throw him off the boat so I save everybody else."
Yeah.
So like when it comes to more realism or whatever, blah blah, like sometimes that's just blatantly not always going to be the case, and there's just certain situations where either there really isn't really a right or wrong, or no matter what, something could be right, but then if something changes in a way, then it could be wrong. Like
Yep.
it's
Mhm.
not simple.
Like
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Jay.
yeah, a good quote that I think Mackie gave about to try to refute moral realism is when he was refuting the claim, when you hurt someone, it is cruel. He says, "What on earth allows you to objectively substantiate that it's cruel? How can you truly objectively prove cruelty? What is it? What tangible sort of entity reinforces that premise? What allows us to consider the truth value of that proposition to be true? There's nothing to lead to. It's the
Yeah,
idea of cruelty is not an objective sort of metric, and that certainly can vary from culture to culture. And Mackie made a good point when trying to combat moral realism. If any,
Mm.
realism tends to catapult on semantics. They try to argue,
Yeah.
well, propositions, that have inherent truth values that are to be true are within these moral judgments. Hence, these moral judgments are facts. I think that the whole fundamental premise of moral realism is flawed, and that's why it hasn't been adopted by Western civilization.
Why do you think we have court systems and
Yeah,
everything? I mean,
exactly.
like
That's a good
like
point.
it just clearly goes to show the flaw in moral
Yeah, a
realism. You
court
know?
serves as a moral compass, and it serves
pretty much
and it represents the
unbiased.
idea. Yeah, exactly, and it represents the idea that morality is arbitrary and ambiguous,
Yeah,
right? And these
exactly.
judges
So
are individuals that have to determine from their own arbitrary moral compass what is the right punishment for any such a crime.
Or
So,
if there shouldn't be a punishment at all, and
or if
maybe it
there,
was just
yeah, or if there's
misconstrued and
not
it
enough
was
at
just
all.
blatant. Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
the jury, it helps, to kind of give a fair shake to the defendant. So I just think that morality is certainly volatile. It's malleable. It's a fluctuating entity.
absolutely.
So
It seems to me that like the moral realism is trying to get down to what is objectively more morally positive, right?
yeah,
And there's very few things that we can deem as such. Like Batman said earlier, killing someone is obviously at its fundamental core a negative uh, act of conduct to enact essentially.
yeah,
But when it gets to different cultures, like Jay said, you have factors like demographics or culture in terms of like religion, and you have politics as well, influencing what is morally righteous or not. Like you take like eating pork, for example, is something that is not morally accepted, but for us, it's no big deal, right? And that is just a stem of their traditionalism that has been uprooted from their beginning, essentially. So ambiguity is part of human nature, and because of that, morality is a huge end result as well. So there are very few things that we can deem morally realistic because our world is full of different people with a huge spectrum of rationalities and ideologies and things of that nature. So
Yeah,
there's
and
very few things that are realistically morally cruel or the opposite of that. So
yeah,
yeah,
and even to say there's something such as a moral axiomatic claim, I think that that is incorrect truly because what might be axiomatic to us, like, oh, don't kill people or
Yeah.
etc., can change from culture to culture. Yeah, that sounds absurd to us because in the Western world, there are these universal sort of laws that we all follow. Don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat. You know, the Ten Commandments, if you will, of
yeah,
most religious scriptures. But if you go back a
Mhm.
thousand years, 2,000 years, death was common and death was
Oh,
revered by
all the
certain
time.
cultures. It is what it is.
It's the main thing of a reaction. Actually, like death was the solution,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
matter how small something was. You
Especially in
know.
religious cultures and religious tribes, death was a symbolic thing. But what I will say,
Yeah.
for me personally, as far as philosophical ideologies that I tend to correspond to, I think Cantonism is a good one. There's some objective metrics in it, like what is the net good and net bad of things. I think it's a good way to try to measure something. Again, what is good and bad can be can vary from person to person, of course. But I
exactly.
would say
And
Yeah,
that
that's another thing too.
Cantonism,
very
Like
subjective.
yeah, I
like
would say
here's
that
another example.
Cantonism is
Like would
certainly a
you
good
nuke a
metric.
city?
Uh,
Would you nuke a city like to stop a disease from spreading
yeah.
around the whole planet? You know what I mean? And be willing to kill so many innocent people? Like how do you gauge the morality in that? Do you deem that wrong
If
or
that's
deem
the
that
only
good or you
choice,
know like
Yeah.
if
you
that's
know?
the only choice, it is the right thing to do, man. You know, but it's a hard call for sure.
Yeah, I tend to look at Cantonism as one of the best ideologies to
Yeah,
try to correspond to
not bad.
because you look at
But
a situation such as, passing legislation and how much people will affect versus how much people the antithesis of that will affect. And I think that trying to calculate arbitrarily, of course, the net good and net bad is a good way to go about things. I just think that trying to consider things axiomatic and as far as your moral compass can be a problem. Eventually, you're going to hit
hey,
a wall. So,
you want to since we're talking about this, this just reminded me of something I thought of a while ago. Here's an interesting question. Because there was a show I was watching, and it kind of brought this up, and I was like, this is interesting. And then I thought of something. I'm like, so the question is, if a person committed horrible crimes or killed like 100 plus people, but then something happens and they get physical brain, different. They're a good person. They're not trying to, be a danger to anyone, whatever. Do they deserve to be punished? And it's like it's an interesting, extremely tricky morality situation, even in court of law. Like there's actually been plenty of examples, like for serial killers and stuff like that too. To where
Hmm.
it's like, it just kind of goes to show how interesting our brains are, and there's legitimately real cases that go on like this too, with proof in science, you name it, and to where it's like where do you even justify that line of reasoning? You know what I mean? Because
yeah.
like it's just crazy because normally if you had a serial killer and he did all this crazy shit, whatever, they go to court, whatever, blah blah, and it goes from there, right? And they're always guilty and moves forward. But let's say you have a situation where like it's a brand new person, whatever, doesn't have no memory, no nothing, not a danger anymore, whatever. That makes shit go fucking crazy because now like it basically puts the person in a situation where they can be defended for and advocated for, to where what is that actually fair? Like, should you punish literally me traveling to someone's body, even though I didn't do nothing. You know what I mean? And like, but yet they have a past in history, and here's this. Like, what
So
do you
you're
think
saying
of
you had
that?
amnesia or something after
Yeah,
the fact? Okay, got you.
like either
Well,
amnesia or fucking or like to the point where if you hit a certain part of your brain, I forgot where it is, to
mhm.
where you actually like just change completely as a person. You have no recollection of anything you did. You're just literally a brand new fucking person. Like if you were reborn. Like it's weird as fuck. And so it just kind of comes to the point where it's like, is it still fair to punish that person due to their past acts or whatever, even though they're no longer technically that
The
person?
same
It's an
person
interesting
anymore.
concept,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Well, let's say that the individual in question did commit a homicide.
yeah,
That's not only taking away someone's life and potential for future growth and transcending generations, but you're also taking away from peers and family. So that kind of stuff and that grave of a situation, I think, demands it demands some level of of
Accountability.
incarceration or something of that sort. And if you have tangible evidence that can prove that individual in question did these acts in the first place, I'm
Mhm.
sorry, man. I mean, I think it's morally correct to punish them for their deeds,
Yeah.
But the court system is always evolving, man.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't even that long ago where like people could use spectral analysis, like during the Salem witch trials, right? Where like, oh, I had this in my dream, so if she's a witch, bam, that's good to go. Or you could use a lie detector test, and that was good enough to punish people. So
Yeah.
the court system is always evolving. Same with humanity and its legislations. So,
Yeah.
but in that circumstance, I think it's morally correct to punish them. I don't know what you guys think
Yeah,
though, but yeah.
like I agree. I do still think it's morally correct to punish them. Like at the end of the day, there needs to be some form of accountability or justice, right? At the end of the day, the acts are still done and whatever, blah blah, this and that. But it is very intriguing and it is very interesting because when I was seeing an example on a show and then even looking further into it and seeing real life cases, there was literally people that were literally like not hold guilty or the as a for defense they were held to a point where it was basically being claimed as immoral to even have a
Huh.
form of punishment or to where even the jury were just like completely conflicted where now it's like going all around and they don't even know what to really do.
Hmm.
So it's just really interesting and it kind of further tags the whole notion that morality is a very strange thing,
Yeah. Morality.
because
Yeah.
yeah.
Morality is constantly evolving, and moral realism, honestly, I think, is proven wrong by nature itself. I think from our own legislation, from our own justice system, moral realism is constantly being debunked. I think that moral realism is just a sort of idealistic ideology to try and answer the question of morality. And even moral
Yeah.
realism itself doesn't establish moral fact itself, which is very, very ironic, I think.
Yeah.
Certainly.
It varies from moral realist to moral realist. How can an ideology be considered one that corresponds to facts if the ideology itself isn't concrete and easy to understand? That's very, very
Yeah.
ironic.
Yeah.
So it's just really interesting. So I thought that was interesting in a way because the way I thought of it is like, what if I was some crazy psychopath, right? And then something happened, and then now I'm a whole other brand new person. I don't know what the fuck anyone's talking about. I'm literally good. I'm not a danger to anyone anymore. Whatever. And then it's like what do you do in that situation? Because
Yeah.
like, and then at the
Yeah.
end of the day, like the way I picture myself in that issue, like if everyone's telling me that I did all this fucked up shit and this and whatever. I actually would want myself to be punished. Like, I'm sorry. I would dead ass be on the stand and be like, yeah, I should be punished no matter what.
Yeah,
I
in
don't
that
know,
case,
whatever.
yeah,
But
in the real world, it would come down to probably a psychological study, psychological evaluation to establish
yeah,
credibility to that. And if
exactly.
there's a way to
Like,
prove that it truly was somebody else and not yourself, I guess theoretically the
oh, for
judge and the
sure.
jury would say, okay, you're free to go. But that would be very hard to prove, neurologically, psychologically. Be very difficult to
Hmm.
prove that it wasn't you. But
Valid point, man.
uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
in the
With
real
our
world, at
levels
least,
of like consciousness, understanding, that would be a hard thing to
very
But
difficult.
actually
that's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
that's a hard,
provide
yeah, because
validity
we don't even
towards.
understand our fucking brains. You know
No,
what I
not
mean?
at
No,
all.
Like,
not at
Yeah,
all,
not at
bro.
it's
all.
one of the
Not at
most
all. We're not even fucking
confusing elements
close.
in life. It's kind of similar to the ocean. I mean, like
Yeah.
we don't know a goddamn thing
Ask
or space.
Pretty much,
Like
man.
ask someone like
Yeah,
Sam
or
Harris.
quantum mechanics.
He'll tell you we don't know shit yet, and that's one of the
yeah,
greatest minds on
Literally.
earth. So
like I forgot the person's name, but there was a dude that was in a similar situation, and to where he wasn't given the verdict of guilty or anything, and he actually like pleaded like for accountability, or whatever, because he like felt remorse and whatever you name it, but just had no recollection of any of these things that he did, whatever, blah blah, yada yada.
yeah,
And he was let off, and the dude just lived a normal life from that point, and just nothing ever
yeah.
happened. He
If
was a whole
anything,
other fucking person. He
if
didn't know his
anything,
family, no nothing.
yeah. If anything, if there was a case that extreme, I would argue for the insane asylum verdict, just to avoid the possibility, whatever it is statistically, of you committing the act again. That's what I would probably
Yeah,
decide.
and that's I'm glad you brought that
Yeah,
up because that's what I also thought of too. That is one of the cons to even if you were to let somebody go because of whatever blah blah, because that actually there was cases of that too where the same situation happened, but since they were let scot free or whatever, or some
Hmm.
half measure of punishment, but not really anything, right? Then next thing you know, they started recollecting their memories and remembering what they did or whatever you name it, and then basically immediately doing the acts again. And now more
Yeah.
people are suffering
Yeah.
when if they just locked them up from the get go, you know, it wouldn't have been. That would have just been done
Yeah.
right there.
So
you know?
yeah, morality in general is an ever evolving. I don't know if I even want to call it a science. It's sort of an entity because science is
It's really not, dude.
yeah,
It's
because science. With the word science, at least for most people, semantically, it represents a word that means and indicates an observable entity that you're learning more and more of. Morality isn't observable; it's
No,
arbitrary.
it's
So,
it's a part of our consciousness, dude,
Yeah.
and that is
there's a
so
word
vast
for
and
that. I can't
infinite.
remember
Like
what it
Mackie
is.
said,
Yeah,
yeah,
there's
like
a word for those type of things.
yeah, like Mackie said, values of morality aren't the same values of science or mathematics. It's not tangible. You can't observe it. You can't lead to a objective conclusion like you can math or science. It's not the same. And that's the problem with moral
Yeah.
realism. But